I'm going to speak a bit about the situation, how we got to where we are now in the last 9 months since that day, December the 17th, where those images came through of the remaining members of the five, and then the simultaneous announcements of Presidents Castro and Obama, and it was such an historic day. I know in Cuba now they talk of, you know, a bit like before and after the 17th of December as being a very pivotal moment. And you know, it's very recent, this history. A few weeks ago we saw the opening of the embassies in Washington and Havana and the flags. Only a few days ago we saw yet more photos of President Raul Castro with Obama, and there was Michelle smiling gleefully in New York. And these images that we're beginning to see of this rapprochement, this re-engagement, are very, very powerful symbols that are broadcast all around the world. And for people watching the world's media, it's very easy for them to think that that's it. It's over and done with. The blockade has ended. The two countries are working closely together in every possible way. And really, you know, we in the Solidarity movement should pack up, go home and move on to something else to campaign on. And I'm sure you've all had friends, well-meaning friends, who are more than delighted to tell you that it's all over, and you know, they're going to nip over to Cuba quickly before it all changes, and now's the time to go, and there are the adverts in The Guardian and so forth telling you, get over to Cuba quickly before it all changes. Same adverts really that have been running for the last 30 odd years. The idea that it's about to significantly change, well, we shall have to see, and predicting the future is a very, very tricky thing. Only last month, on the other hand, from what we see in those images, it was only last month that the United States decided to maintain Cuba's designation under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The issue of Guantanamo, the Americans have said that issue is not on the negotiating table. And the blockade, as you've heard today, remains very much intact. And this month, in a couple of weeks, Cuba will again present its annual motion to the United Nations, calling for an end to the extraterritorial application of the blockade. 188 countries last year. We'll see, I mean, now you've negotiated to deal with Palau and the Marshall Islands, which I think is a wonderful thing. The numbers may yet go up even further, a real testament to Cuban diplomacy at this time. So, while things have moved and we've seen the images, we in the Solidarity movement have to be extremely clear that there is a huge, huge difference between that process of re-establishing relations and the question of normalising relations. It's a very, very big difference, and we have to make that clear to our membership, to the trade unions, to our supporters, because it's our job to make sure that we continue with the much needed solidarity that's been talked about. Now, on that day in December, the first thing that we saw, and we were jumping up and down, and believe me, we were really jumping up and down, was that aircraft and the images of the three comrades returning to Cuba, the three remaining members of the Miami Five who had been locked up for 16 years. And I'm sure that everyone in this room knows that story. In fact, everyone in this room, I'm sure, played a part in that struggle for the freedom and justice for the five. And I want to take this opportunity once again to thank all of you, and particularly to thank Linda and SERTUC, Unison, Unite, all the British trade unions for the amazing job that they did in that campaign. I was in Havana along with Natasha in March, and we were there with the former General Secretary of Unite, Tony Woodley, and a number of delegates from Unite. And we spent a wonderful, amazing few days with all of the five and their families. And they themselves reiterated their thanks to all of you, and particularly to the British trade union movement for the role that was played here, the exemplary role that was played. But the question of the five and their freedom, I think, is a real backdrop to the situation and where we find ourselves today. Their story is one of bravery, strength, standing firm in the face of tremendous aggression. They never gave up. They didn't give in to the threats, the intimidation. And all those strengths that the five showed are the strengths shown by the Cuban people over 50 years. Because for 50 years, in the David and Goliath fashion, the Cuban people have stood firm and proud in the face of terrible, terrible aggression from the world's largest superpower right on their doorstep. Now, since December, there have been lots of meetings. We've seen them, I think maybe 4 bilateral meetings between Cuba and the US in Havana and Washington. And when we were in Havana in March, we met with the head of the Cuban delegation, with Josefina Vidal, who's the woman who leads the delegations in those negotiations. And when we met her, she was incredibly proud, incredibly strong. And when we asked her, how's it going, a big, broad smile came over her face. And why shouldn't that be the case? Because, of course, Cuba finds itself in a very good position historically at this moment in those negotiations. It was the United States that blinked first. It was the United States that came to Cuba. Now, why was that at this particular time? Many people say, well, why now? Why after so long has the United States decided to negotiate and move to a new track? And some people may say, you know, Obama wants his legacy, perhaps. It could be any type of reason. There are many reasons and many interpretations. Maybe it's the changing demographics in Florida with the death, if you like, passing away of the old guard, the old Batista era in Florida. Maybe that's one of the main factors. But from many of our points of view, we do believe that it's more a question, as ever with these things, of the economics of the situation. And particularly the need of US business to engage, not just with Cuba. Cuba is small and it's a valuable area to engage in the economic environment in Cuba, but with the wider region. And the United States business had seen the rise of China and Russia and their relationships in that region with Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador, right across the region. And right there in their own backyard, challenging their own monopoly, if you like, of that region. And Cuba, which has become central to all those progressive changes that we heard about in the other seminar with, you know, the progressive governments in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Nicaragua, and so on. All those governments have made clear to the United States that to engage with us, you need to accommodate Cuba. And when the Organisation of American Summit in Panama in April took place, all those leaders, including, by the way, President Santos of Colombia, no real progressive friend, told the United States, unless Cuba are accepted back into the Organisation of American States, then you, President Obama, will not be at that summit. Yeah. And that solidarity, I think that solidarity of those progressive governments of the region has been absolutely wonderful and absolutely important in the shift in the United States position towards Cuba. And incidentally, when the United States came to unlock that door, the Cubans said, we want something first. We want our 5 back. Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why on that very same day, the remaining members of the Miami 5 were returned to Havana. Now, clearly, and it's our assessment in the campaign, the United States has not changed its ideas in terms of wanting to see a change, a political change in Cuba. They want to see the back of Cuban socialism. They want to see the end of that threat of a good example in their hemisphere. The US, as has been said many times, it just recognised that it was failing. 50 years of failure. Obama himself said, we can't carry on doing the same thing as we've been doing for 50 years and expect a different result. John Kerry, the Secretary of State, said, this is a real opportunity to provide the people of Cuba with that possibility of transformation. And I hope that we can complete that task. We're not going to focus on what the Cuban government are going to do for us, but what we can do for the Cubans and the Americans. And this kind of talk isn't just talk, it's backed up with serious money. Recently, far from ending their practices of intervention and regime change policies in Cuba, The United States recently announced $30 million for so-called democracy programs in Cuba. That is just a misnomer for the same old regime change policies they've been carrying out for 50 years. And by the way, last year, that was $20 million. So since December the 7th, they've actually increased that direct funding for regime change policy. So no wonder that one of the bones of discussion in the negotiations is the behaviour of US diplomats in their new embassy. Of course the Cubans are going to be worried and wondering whether the United States will play the diplomatic game and abide by the international conventions, diplomatic conventions. Now, Josephine and Vidal, the Cubans, are conducting the negotiations as we know they would, in a meticulous and straightforward and detailed manner. And after 55 years of resistance, they're not going to go into those negotiations ready to give up everything that they have gained from their struggles. All they are asking for in those negotiations is to have an equal seat at the table and to have negotiations based on mutual respect and understanding. Now you would think that that is obvious, if two countries are to negotiate the future, that would be normal, but the United States has not ever conducted its view of Cuba or its negotiations or its position vis-à-vis Cuba in a normal fashion. It's had 55 years of seeing Cuba as that tiny, silly, strange, socialist, communist, mad little island. And therefore it's a very, very difficult position for them to sit at a table equally with the Cubans. But it is something that they would have to learn to be able to do. Cuba has repeatedly made clear that, just going back, there's a whole host, and I think Carlos set them out many times today. I think there were 5 or 6 key issues that he talked about. The first is the question of the interference in Cuba's affairs. That has to stop. That intervention in the internal politics of Cuba has to stop. That is not normal behaviour in a world where you have normalised relations. Secondly, Guantanamo Bay has to be returned. You cannot have a normalised relationship with a country that is illegally occupying your land against your wishes. That can't be normal, and that has to be returned to Cuba. And that's without even talking about the atrocities going on inside that American-occupied land. Thirdly, TV and radio broadcasts, as Keith Bollinger was talking about, broadcasting crazy propaganda against all the norms of international agreements, telecommunications union agreements and so forth. You cannot continue if you want to have a normalised relationship. The issue of compensation has been talked about, and again, you're talking of billions. $800 billion is the figure the Cubans put on the cost of the blockade to their economy over 55 years. There are many, many issues. I mean, one of the worst ones from my perspective is the, I think Carlos or somebody called it the brain drain. America has a policy of funding the position to encourage Cuban doctors and nurses and teachers working abroad to defect. That's nothing to do with a normal relationship. That is a terrible indictment of their position vis-à-vis Cuba. But of course it is the blockade that is the worst affront. And the US has made clear at the time when they announced the terrorism list, the designation, they said, just to confirm, this is a State Department press release, just to confirm, economic sanctions under OFAC, that's the Treasury, Cuban assets control regulations will remain in effect, and most transactions with Cuban nationals and the government of Cuba will remain prohibited. That's their position, and that's what they're carrying out. We may see a lessening, and the delisting on the terrorist list may help companies, but it hasn't really done anything yet. And we saw from Brian Wilson, and I think that was a very indicative point that he made. And Brian Wilson, if you look at his card, he is a UK business ambassador for the British government visiting Cuba. And he said that the British government is still being complicit with the United States in the blockade. And we, as a campaign in this country, must work to encourage our own government to have a better relationship in terms of trade and exchange with Cuba. We don't know what's going to happen in the US. We don't know, as Carlos says, about the future the Congress and the new elected presidents may take. I don't think there's a way back, really, on this track of moving towards normalised relations. After all, the Cubans themselves are not at all stupid. They're very, very highly educated, and they're very educated politically. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans have travelled around the world in international missions. Normally, in developing countries where they've seen poverty, they've seen illiteracy, they've seen hunger, they come back to Cuba and they see their society. It's not perfect, but it's not like that. And they are not going to give that up easily. They're not going to roll over in these negotiations. I'm going to finish now because I know we're running out of time. But when we were in Havana in March, we interviewed Gerardo Hernandez, the leader, or one of the main people from the Miami Five, and he said a very interesting quote. And I think it's very key for this debate, because he said this: the fact is, for imperialism, we are just the bad sheep that got away from the herd. Yeah. And they, the United States, will never forgive us for that. They are never going to let us be. So they have to punish Cuba, and they have to punish Venezuela, no matter what their rhetoric is, no matter how they change a little bit here and a little bit there, their system has it inside. They are not going to decide overnight to say, okay, let's be good neighbours now. And that's why I say we have to remain vigilant. They will never forgive the Venezuelan revolution, and in the same way, they will never forgive the Cuban revolution. So what Gerardo says, I think, sums up very well the relationship. For us in the campaign, we have to remain vigilant. These are exciting times for Cuba, for the Cuban people. There's a lot of expectation. And what they are hoping for is that the US will back off a little, give them a bit more breathing space here, a bit more breathing space there, so that Cuba can develop its society in the way that they see fit. We have to keep campaigning. It's been said here, we have to keep up our efforts. We need to be alert. We need to be ready to respond to media attacks on Cuba, efforts of destabilisation. And we have to be ready to be vocal in that response within our own media. We need to launch a huge campaign of support for the whole of Latin America in their call to create a zone of peace in Latin America, to get rid of the US bases dotted around that region, and including the base at Guantanamo. We need to support and spread information about the work of Cuba, the tremendous achievements in health, in education, in public care for all their citizens. It's something that we should be, or they should be proud of, and it's also something that we can learn from, and we should share that experience as widely as possible. We should celebrate Cuba's internationalism and its international solidarity. With, in the Ebola crisis in West Africa, in Haiti, in Kashmir, you name it, that is an inspirational story, and we should share that and support it. As I said, we are a British campaign. We must lobby our own governments and work with our own government to support trade and exchange with Cuba. Because at the moment, we're talking about a few memorandi. It's on paper. We need to turn that into real trade, real exchange, and that would be a wonderful impetus to a better relationship for us, but also for the United States. So in many ways, the Solidarity Campaign's role remains the same, building that broad base of trade unionists, of parliamentary support, of civil society, in support of a free, independent and sovereign Cuba. And I hope, as I said earlier, that any of you who are not members, and if you receive an email, that's one thing, but if you are a member, you receive our magazine. If you're not members, you should join, because that is the best way of giving solidarity. Cuba has been a real example, a real inspiration in so many ways. And that example has been built on by the sacrifices and the efforts of the Cuban people over many, many years. And our job is to continue to repay them for their efforts. And the best way to do that is by our own hard work, our own efforts, and our own solidarity. Thank you.